Thomas Miller wiped the frost from his small cottage window and stared out at the endless white landscape. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and the wind howled like a wild animal through the Yorkshire hills. His small cattle ranch looked like a frozen wasteland, and he could barely see his barn through the thick curtain of snowflakes. The winter of 1985 was testing everyone in the valley. Thomas had lived on this land his whole life, just like his father and grandfather before him, but he had never seen weather this harsh. The snow was so deep that his cattle could not reach the grass beneath. And he was running low on hay too. "Feed them." Thomas pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside into the bitter cold. The wind hit him like a punch, making his eyes water and his cheeks sting. He needed to check the fence line at the far end of his property. Some of his cattle had wandered off yesterday, and he was worried they might have broken through the old wooden fence. He walked slowly through the deep snow, his boots sinking with each step. The cold air burned his lungs, and his breath came out in thick white clouds every few minutes. He had to stop and warm his hands inside his coat pockets. The wind was so strong that it nearly knocked him over twice. As Thomas reached the fence line, he saw something dark against the white snow. At first, he thought it might be one of his cattle that had fallen down, but as he got closer, his heart jumped with shock. It was a man lying face down in the snow, completely still. Thomas ran as fast as he could through the deep snow. When he reached the figure, he carefully turned the man over. It was an elderly gentleman with white hair and a kind face. His skin was pale blue, and his lips were the color of winter berries. The old man was barely breathing, and his clothes were soaked through with melted snow. Without thinking for even 1 second, Thomas lifted the stranger onto his shoulders. The old man was heavier than he looked, but Thomas was strong from years of ranch work. He carried him step by step back toward his cottage, stopping every few yards to catch his breath and make sure the man was still breathing. The walk back seemed to take forever. Thomas's legs burned with exhaustion and sweat mixed with snow on his face despite the freezing cold. But he did not put the old man down, not even once. He knew that every minute counted if he was going to save this stranger's life. Finally, Thomas reached his cottage and kicked open the front door. He gently laid the old man on his small sofa near the fireplace. The stranger's skin felt like ice, and Thomas could see that his whole body was shaking from the cold. Thomas quickly threw more wood onto the dying fire. He blew on the embers until flames began to dance and crackle, filling the room with warmth and light. Then he grabbed his warmest blanket from his bed and wrapped it carefully around the old man's shoulders. The cottage was small and simple, with just one main room, a tiny kitchen and a bedroom. Thomas did not have much money, and his furniture was old and worn, but it was warm and dry, and right now, that was exactly what the stranger needed most. Thomas went to his kitchen cupboard and found his last tin of vegetable soup. He had been saving it for tomorrow's dinner, but this was more important. He heated the soup on his small stove and brought it to the old man, who was now awake but still shivering terribly. The stranger's eyes were filled with gratitude as he looked up at Thomas. His voice was weak and scratchy when he spoke. "What's your name, friend?" Thomas asked gently, holding the warm bowl of soup. "William." The old man whispered through chattering teeth, "William Hartwell. I was walking to my son's house in the next village when the storm caught me. I lost my way in the snow." Thomas helped William sit up and gave him small spoonfuls of the hot soup. Color slowly began to return to the old man's face, and his shivering started to calm down. Thomas sat beside him all through the long, cold night, adding wood to the fire every hour and making sure William stayed warm. Even though Thomas was cold himself and tired from the long day, he never complained. He gave William his own warm socks and made him tea with his lasty bag. Throughout the night, he checked on William every few minutes, making sure he was breathing well and staying comfortable. As the first light of dawn crept through the cottage windows, William was feeling much stronger. His skin had returned to a healthy color, and he could speak without his teeth chattering. He looked at Thomas with tears of gratitude in his old eyes. "You saved my life, young man," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will never forget your kindness. You could have walked past me in the snow, but you choose to help a stranger instead." Thomas smiled warmly and helped William finish the last of the soup. Outside, the storm was finally ending, and pale sunlight was beginning to shine through the clouds. As the morning sun climbed higher in the clear winter sky, William Hartwell sat by the warm fire and watched Thomas move around the small cottage. The old man's strength was returning with each passing hour, and he felt grateful to be alive. He had spent many cold nights outdoors during his long life, but last night could have been his last without Thomas's help. William studied the young rancher as he prepared a simple breakfast of bread and butter. Thomas moved with quiet purpose, never rushing but always working. There was something special about this man that William recognized immediately. In his many years of life, he had met all kinds of people, but few had shown such selfless kindness to a complete stranger. While Thomas was not looking, William smiled to himself. He had not told the young man everything about who he was. William Hartwell was not just any old farmer from the valley. For 40 years, he had served as the unofficial leader of the farming community throughout Yorkshire. When neighbors had disputes about land or cattle, they came to William for help. When young farmers needed advice about crops or weather, they sought out his wisdom. Every person in the valley knew William's name and respected his fair judgment. He had helped settle hundreds of arguments between families and had never taken sides unfairly. Farmers trusted him because he always put the good of the community above his own interests. His word was as solid as the stone walls that divided the fields. But William had chosen not to reveal this information to Thomas during the night. He wanted to see what kind of man had saved him, without his reputation influencing their interaction. What he discovered impressed him more than anything he had seen in years. After they finished their simple breakfast, Thomas stood up and reached for his coat. "I need to check on my cattle," Thomas said. "You rest here by the fire as long as you need to. There's no rush." William offered to help, but Thomas shook his head with a gentle smile. "You've been through enough. Stay warm," through the small window. William watched Thomas walk through the snow to his barn. The young rancher carried heavy buckets of water to his cattle and spread fresh hay for them to eat. Even though Thomas looked tired and cold, he worked with patience and care. William noticed that Thomas fed his animals before coming back inside to eat his own breakfast. After an hour, Thomas returned to the cottage with rosy cheeks and snow on his boots. "My cattle are fine," he said, "but I saw that your neighbor's fence has some broken posts from the storm. Would you like to ride over there with me to help fix it?" William was amazed. Here was a man who had spent all night caring for a stranger, and now he wanted to help his neighbor without being asked. This was the kind of character that William rarely encountered, even among the good people he knew. They walked together to the neighboring farm, where Thomas spent 2 hours repairing the damaged fence. He used his own tools and materials, and he refused to accept any payment from the grateful neighbor. William watched every moment, seeing how Thomas worked with skill and dedication. When they returned to Thomas's cottage, the young rancher went to his small stable and led out his horse, his sturdy brown mare named Belle. "Take Belle to ride to your son's house," Thomas offered. The roads are still dangerous, and you shouldn't walk that far after what you've been through." William was touched by this generous offer. Belle was clearly Thomas's only horse, and without her, the young rancher would have to walk everywhere until she was returned. "Take my coat too," Thomas said, removing his warmest winter coat. "The morning is still cold, and you have a long ride ahead." This act of generosity moved William deeply. He realized that Thomas was giving away his most valuable possessions to help someone he had known for less than 24 hours. The young man expected nothing in return and seemed genuinely happy to help Dot as William prepared to leave. He placed his weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Son," he said with deep sincerity, "you have shown me something rare in this world. True kindness without expecting anything back. A man who shares his fire in the darkness will never stand alone in the light." Thomas listened to these words with respect, though he did not fully understand their meaning. He simply nodded and helped William climb onto Belle's back. "Thank you for everything," William said as he gathered the reins. "I will find a way to return your horse and coat very soon." Thomas waved goodbye as William rode down the snowy path toward the main road. The old man sat straight in the saddle despite his age, and Belle carried him safely through the deep snow. After William disappeared from sight, Thomas returned to his daily work around the ranch. He repaired a section of his own fence, chopped wood for his fire, and prepared feed for his cattle. He felt good about helping the old man, but he did not expect anything to come from their meeting. That afternoon, William Hartwell began visiting farms throughout the valley. At each stop, he told the story of the young rancher who had saved his life. He described Thomas's selfless kindness, his generous spirit, and his willingness to help others without asking for anything in return. Every person who heard William's story was deeply moved by Thomas's actions. 3 weeks had passed since the night Thomas saved William Hartwell from the snowstorm. Life had returned to its quiet routine on the small ranch. The snow was finally melting, and Thomas could see patches of brown grass beginning to show through the white blanket that covered his land. His cattle were healthy and strong, and he felt hopeful about the coming spring. Thomas was mending a saddle in his barn when he heard the sound of car engines coming up his dirt road. He looked outside and saw 2 black cars driving toward his cottage. This was unusual because very few people ever visited his remote ranch, especially people driving fancy cars like these. The cars stopped in front of his cottage, and Thomas watched as 3 men got out. One was a tall man in an expensive suit, who looked like he had never worked a day outdoors in his life. The other 2 were large, muscular men wearing dark clothes and serious expressions. They looked like the kind of men who were paid to intimidate people. Thomas wiped his hands on his work clothes and walked outside to meet his unexpected visitors. The man in the suit was carrying a leather briefcase and had a cold smile on his face that made Thomas feel uncomfortable immediately. "Are you Thomas Miller?" the man asked in a sharp voice. "Yes, that's me," Thomas replied. "What can I do for you gentlemen?" The man opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official-looking papers. "My name is Charles Blackwood. I'm a businessman from London, and I have some important news for you." Thomas felt his stomach tighten with worry. In his experience, official papers usually meant trouble for people like him who struggled to pay their bills on time. "This land belongs to me now," Blackwood announced coldly, waving the papers in the air. "I bought your debt from the bank 3 days ago. According to these legal documents, you owe more money than your ranch is worth." Thomas felt the world spinning round him as he took the papers with shaking hands. The numbers on the documents seemed right, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. He had been making his payments to the bank every month, even if they were sometimes a few days late. "I don't understand," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been paying the bank. This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built this cottage with his own hands." Blackwood's cold smile grew wider. "That doesn't matter now. Business is business. You have 24 hours to pack your things and leave this property. After that, you'll be trespassing on my land." Thomas looked round at the hills and fields. He had known his entire life. Every tree, every fence post, every stone held memories of his family. His father had taught him to ride horses in the pasture behind the cottage. His grandfather had shown him how to care for cattle in the old barn. "Please, Mr. Blackwood," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady, "this ranch is all I have in the world. Can't we work out some kind of payment plan? I'll work extra jobs in town. I'll sell my cattle if I have to." "No deals," Blackwood replied with no emotion in his voice. "I'm not interested in your cattle or your problems. I'm building a shopping center here. The location is perfect for my business plans." One of the large men stepped forward and cracked his knuckles loudly. "Boss says you got until tomorrow sunset," he said in a threatening voice. "If you're still here after that, we'll help you pack." Thomas felt fear and anger rising in his chest, but he knew he was no match for these men. He had no money to hire a lawyer and no family members who could help him fight this injustice. It seemed like his whole world was crumbling round him. After the 3 men drove away in their expensive cars, Thomas sat down heavily on his front porch. He stared out at the rolling hills and green fields that would soon belong to a stranger who saw them only as a place to build stores and parking lots. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Thomas had watched thousands of sunsets from this same spot, but tonight felt like it might be his last. He had nowhere to go and no money to start over somewhere else as darkness fell over the valley. Thomas went inside his cottage and began packing his few belongings into old cardboard boxes. He wrapped his grandfather's tools carefully in newspaper and packed his father's books into a wooden crate. Every item reminded him of the family history he was about to lose forever. Thomas was so focused on his packing that he did not notice the sounds outside his cottage. Throughout the valley, men were quietly leaving their homes and farms. Some rode horses through the darkness, while others walked along the country roads carrying lanterns and flashlights. Word had spread quickly through the farming community about Thomas's trouble. William Hartwell had visited every farm within 20 miles, telling people about the injustice being done to the man who had saved his life. The story of Thomas's kindness during the snowstorm had touched many hearts. And now those same people were coming to help him in his darkest hour. Thomas had barely slept during his last night in the cottage. He spent most of the dark hours sitting by his window, looking out at the land he was about to lose forever. Every shadow and shape in the moonlight held memories of his childhood and his family's history on this French dot as the first pale light of dawn began to appear over the eastern hills. Thomas heard something that made him think he was dreaming. It sounded like horses walking and men talking in quiet voices. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked out the window more carefully. What he saw made his heart jump with surprise. A man on horseback was riding slowly up the path to his cottage, and behind him came another rider, then another. Thomas pressed his face against the cold glass and watched as more and more people appeared in the early morning light. They were coming from every direction across his property. Some rode horses, while others walked on foot. Many drove old trucks and farm vehicles that moved carefully through the muddy fields. All of them were heading straight toward his cottage. Thomas quickly pulled on his clothes and stepped outside onto his front porch. The morning air was cold and fresh, and he could see his breath in small white clouds as he watched in amazement. Dozens of men continued to arrive at his ranch. The first rider to reach his cottage was William Hartwell, sitting tall and proud on Bell, the same horse Thomas had loaned him 3 weeks earlier. Behind William came men that Thomas recognized from the valley, farmers he had met at the market, shopkeepers from the nearby village, and workers from the local businesses. "What's happening here?" Thomas asked, his voice full of wonder and confusion. William climbed down from Bell and walked up to the porch with a warm smile on his weathered face. "We heard about your trouble, son," he said, placing a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "No man who showed such kindness to a stranger will face his problems alone." Thomas looked round at all the faces surrounding his cottage. There was Henry, the blacksmith, who had always been friendly when Thomas brought his tools for repair. There was Robert, the grain dealer, who had given Thomas good prices for his small harvests. There was David, the veterinarian, who had helped save one of Thomas's sick cattle the previous summer. "But how did you all know?" Thomas asked, still not quite believing what he was seeing. William's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. Word travels fast in a small community, especially when it's about someone who has shown true character. 3 weeks ago, you saved my life, without expecting anything in return. Now it's our turn to help you." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, more men continued to arrive. Thomas watched as neighbors he barely knew walked across his fields to join the growing crowd. Young men came with their fathers and grandfathers. Even some of the older boys from the village school had come to show their support. By the time the morning was fully bright, Thomas counted more than 200 men standing round his property. They formed a protective circle that stretched from his cottage to his barn and beyond to his fence lines. Some carried walking sticks or farm tools, but their faces were peaceful and determined. The men talked quietly among themselves, but their message was clear without words. They had come to protect Thomas Miller, and they were not planning to leave any time soon. At exactly 9 o'clock, Thomas heard the sound of car engines coming down his road. His stomach tightened with fear as he recognized the same two black cars from yesterday. Charles Blackwood had returned with his security guards, and this time he had brought even more help. Behind the two black cars came a large truck filled with workers carrying boxes and equipment. Blackwood clearly expected to begin tearing down Thomas's cottage and preparing the land for construction today. But when the cars reached the edge of Thomas's property, they stopped suddenly. Blackwood stepped out of the first car instead, in shock at the crowd of men surrounding the ranch. His mouth fell open, and his face turned red with anger and surprise. "What is the meaning of this?" Blackwood shouted, waving his papers in the air. "I have legal documents that prove I own this land. You people are trespassing on my property." A man stepped forward from the crowd. Thomas recognized him as James Cooper, the respected school teacher from the village. James was known throughout the community as a quiet, intelligent man who understood the law. "Mr. Blackwood," James said in a calm, clear voice, "we have legal rights to peaceful assembly. We are standing on public roads and plots, not on private property. We are not breaking any laws by being here." Blackwood's face grew even redder as he realized his situation. He had expected to intimidate one lone rancher, but instead he faced an entire community that had united to protect Thomas. His security guards looked nervous as they counted the determined faces surrounding them. "You can't stop progress," Blackwood yelled, but his voice sounded less confident than before. "I have money and lawyers. I'll find a way to remove all of you." The crowd of men stood silently, their presence speaking louder than any words. Their message was clear. They would not abandon Thomas Miller in his time of need. Faced with 200 determined community members, Blackwood realized that his bullying tactics would not work today. The sight of 200 men standing together on Thomas's ranch sent Charles Blackwood into a rage. But it also made him desperate. He knew that his plans to steal the land had failed. So he climbed back into his black car and drove away as fast as he could. His security guards and workers followed him, leaving clouds of dust on the country road. The community members who had gathered to protect Thomas stayed on his ranch for the rest of that day. They wanted to make sure that Blackwood would not return with more men or try to cause trouble when no one was watching. As the hours passed, the men began to share stories about their own experiences with the wealthy businessman. Henry the blacksmith told everyone how Blackwood had tried to buy his shop for a far less than it was worth. Robert the grain dealer explained how Blackwood had offered to purchase his business using papers that looked suspicious. One by one, the men realized that Thomas was not Blackwood's first victim. William Hartwell listened to all these stories with growing anger. As the respected leader of the farming community, he knew that something had to be done to stop Blackwood from hurting more innocent people. That evening, he rode to the county courthouse and spoke with the local magistrate about what had happened. Within 3 days, investigators from the county office arrived to examine Blackwood's business practices. What they discovered shocked everyone in the valley. Charles Blackwood had been using fake documents and illegal methods to steal land from struggling farmers all across the county. He had targeted people like Thomas, who lived alone and had no money to hire lawyers. The investigators found evidence that Blackwood had cheated more than 20 families out of their farms and business. He had been working with Corrupt Bank officials who helped him create Volstead records. Together, they had stolen thousands of acres of land that they planned to develop into shopping centers and housing projects. When the truth came out, Blackwood was arrested and charged with fraud and theft. The fake documents he had used against Thomas were declared illegal, which meant that Thomas's debt was completely cleared. The young rancher was free to keep his family's land without owing anyone a single penny. But the most important change that came from this experience was not the legal victory. It was the way the community itself had been transformed by working together to help Thomas. The farmers and workers who had stood up to Blackwood discovered that they were stronger when they supported each other. After the crisis was over, the men began meeting regularly at Thomas's ranch to discuss ways they could continue helping their neighbors. They started sharing expensive farm equipment instead of each person buying his own tools. During harvest season, they worked together to bring in crops more quickly and efficiently than any of them could manage alone. Thomas's small cottage became the unofficial meeting place for the entire valley community. Every month, families gathered there for potluck dinners where everyone brought food to share. During holidays like Christmas and Easter, people came from miles away to celebrate together on Thomas's land. The man who had once felt so alone and isolated now found himself at the center of a caring community. His ranch, which had almost been lost to a greedy businessman, became a symbol of what people could accomplish when they worked together with kindness and determination. As the years passed, Thomas never forgot the lesson he had learned from his experience with William Hartwell and Charles Blackwood. He continued to help his neighbors whenever they faced difficulties, and he always welcomed strangers with the same warmth he had shown that snowy February night. Thomas married a kind woman named Mary from the next village, and they raised 3 children on the ranch. His children grew up hearing the story of how their father's simple act of kindness had saved an old man's life and brought an entire community together. When Thomas's hair turned gray and his back began to bend from years of hard work, he became the valley's unofficial storyteller. Visitors often came to his ranch to hear about the night that changed everything. Thomas would sit on his front porch, the same spot where he had once faced losing everything, and tell the tale to anyone who wanted to listen. He always ended the story the same way, with words that had become famous throughout the county. "I thought I was just sharing my fire with a stranger that cold night," Thomas would say, his eyes twinkling with the memory. "But I was really lighting a flame that would warm our whole community for generations to come." When we show kindness to others, especially when we have very little to give ourselves, that kindness comes back to us in ways we never could have imagined. Thomas lived to be 87 years old, spending every one of those years on the ranch his family had built. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the children and grandchildren who had learned from his example of generosity and compassion. His story became a local legend that parents told their child, and teachers shared with their students. It was passed down through generations as proof that one person's simple act of kindness really can change the world in ways that last forever. The ranch still stands today, and visitors can still see the old cottage where Thomas shared his fire with William Hartwell on that cold February night so many years ago.